If Shneur Kotler, his yahrzeit is the same day. Thank you very much.
But I want to
That's
ask
about
you. I
trouble.
want to ask you.
So Schusa Yogan Aleim Val Kol Yisrael.
I want to ask you. I would happen to be in Gimel Tammuz, not knowing if it even the lower Travis yard site. I'm such an ignorant guy. I was in I was in New York, and I went to the oil, the oil, and I have to tell you,
You can't get him on
no, no,
Gimel
no,
Tammuz.
no, whatever, I was there, right?
Right.
There's buses and buses and buses, right? Is that and Lakewood for Travis yard site? Buses and buses in Lakewood?
I don't think so.
Oh, yeah, really? Okay, because they all live there.
No, because they're all kind of nice. Okay. Sagt der Heilige Gemara. So we should
You're the time I pointed. That was good. No, that was kind of nice.
And I went from Lakewood to Crown Heights for the Leviathan. Remember, you found out their lives. And there were people who were so disoriented because in their mind they about Triple Mashiach and they didn't know how to process it. Okay. So we are on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, believe. So let me just quickly get there. We're all the way at the bottom of Yud Amud Beis. Yesterday we were learning the chronicles of Rebbe and Antonino. And the Gemara said there were two people who were from Edom that were spared, Antoninus and a gentleman by the name of Ketia Bar Shalom. He spoke up to speak in defense of the Jews, and he convinced the bad Caesar, the evil Caesar, not to kill them. So the Gemara tells us, we'll start, let's say, 3 lines from the bottom. After the Baskel came out and said, Kedia Bar Shalom Mezumin, L'chaya Adam Abba, the 3 lines from the bottom of the Yud Amud Beis, Bacha Rebbe V'Omar, Yesh Koina Eilamoy B'Sha'achas. It's sometimes you could be Koina your Eilam Abba in 1 minute, as Ketia Bar Shalom was, V'Yesh Koina Eilamoy B'Kama Shana. Zok Gemara, Antoninus Shimshei LeRebbe. Antoninus was Mishamish Rebbe, as we learned. And Adrachon, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce his name, Adrachon Shemshei LeRav. He was also a goy who was Mishamish Rav. Let me see if he tells me the exact. Adrachon.
That's the right way, according to the advice.
Kishachev Antoninus, when Antoninus died, Amar Rebbe said, Nispar de Chavila, the bundle opened up. In other words, our connection is now over. And that means they're not going to be together in Adam Abba. So even though, in fact, Antoninus got into Adam Abba, but he wasn't going to be in Rebbe's area at the time. Okay, we have an intruder here. There's this fly that's harassing us over here. Let's see if we could convince it to move on. So even though Antoninus wasn't in Adam Abba, he wasn't amongst Rebbe. That's why Antoninus said, Halavai, I should be Zoicha to be your stepping stool in Adam Abba. But he didn't get that. And Adrachon, Kishochav Adrachon, when Adrachon died, Omar Rav said the same thing, Nisbar de Chavila, which Rashi explains as saying, Ahavasenu, Nikshur, Nefesh B'Nefesh, we were so close that now is unraveled. Now the Gemara talks about Unkelus Bar Kloinimus. Igayer, he became a ger. And of course, the Caesar was not happy about this, so he summoned him. So Unkelus must have been an extremely convincing and persuasive person, because look what happened. Shodar, Caesar, Gunda, the Remoi Abasrei. The Caesar sent a Gunda, is like a Gedud, a battalion of troops, to arrest and bring him. So what he did was Moshchinu Bekroi. Using psukim, he was able to convince this Gedud that he's right. And Igyur, they all became Gerim. So the first shaila is, I thought you're not allowed to try to convince people to become Gerim. Right? We discourage people from joining Yiddishkeit. So the Masifta brings down from Mefarshim that the halacha that you have to push away a ger, that's a yid. But a ger himself is allowed to convince his friends to come and join with him. And that was what Unkelus was doing with that. Hodar Shadar Gunda de Remoyachrina. So then the Caesar said, okay, this time I'm going to send tough soldiers, not wusses who are easily persuaded and they're gullible. They listen to the arguments of uncles. So they sent another ambassador, but this time he warned them, don't get involved in any type of conversation with him because he's going to outwit you and then you're going to become a Jewish. As they were taking him to go, he told them, I want to talk to you, but nothing to do with Judaism, nothing to do with learning. I'm just going to speak to you about worldly events. Let's talk about what it said today in the Toronto Star, Sun, or Global Mail. We'll talk about a secular, neutral thing. And he asked him as follows: Nipura, which is some level of authority, he's a person with some level of authority, although a lower level of authority. Nokat Nura Kame Pifura. He would hold a light like serving the Pifura, who was on a higher level of authority. He was the junior, he held it light for the senior. Pifura Leduchsa. Duchsa Lahagmoina. Hagmoina Lekuma. So Kuma was, I guess, the highest level of authority there. Rashi says he was the Melech. In other words, every person will be Mishamish, will serve the authority above him. What about the top authority, the Kuma himself? Minakat Nura Mekama Inchi. Do you think he holds the light in front of regular citizens? Does he go around taking out people's garbage? As it says, to serve and protect? Does he actually go and help people? Amr they told him, of course not. He's the king. Everybody's service is him. Amr Lahu, but by the Jews, it's a little bit different. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Nakat Nura Kama Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu held the light to help brighten up the path of the Jews. Tichshiv, when Klal Yisrael left Mitzrayim and it was dark, it says, Vashem Hoylech Lefneim Yomam. Let's look at the pasuk inside. Vashem Hoylech Lefneim Yomam Ba'amud Onan, leading the way, Lanchoisam Aderech, but Velayla Ba'amud Eish Lahar Lahem. So imagine their king services them. What a concept, where the king actually takes responsibility and cares for and protects his nation. When they heard that, Igyur Kuli, they all became Jewish. Now, the Mefarshim say that didn't make them Jewish instantly, but that piqued their interest into learning more, and then he was able to draw them into a conversation and to show them that the Torah is correct. Hadish Shadar Gunda, Achwina Basrei. The Caesar wasn't giving up. But this time he sent a third battalion. He told them, never mind, don't engage in conversation. Don't talk a word. Do not say one word to him. Arrest him and bring him in. So when they grabbed him, they saw a mezuzah on the door. Unkelus put his hand on it, but not saying a word. And the bays sticks in, and he laughed. So they asked him, why are you laughing? We're arresting you. What's so funny? Why are you laughing? He told them, so he drew them in by laughing, by doing something unusual, and he told why are you laughing? He told them, I'm sorry, he asked them, they asked him, why is he laughing? So he asked them, well, what is this that I just touched that made me laugh? They told him, we don't know what it is. You tell us what this is. He told him, the normal way of the world is Melech Basar Adam Yosy Mibafnim. A king sits in his palace that's fortified and protected. The Avoda Mishamin Oyso Mibachutz, and the Avodim stand outside to protect the king. The Ilu Hakadosh Baruch Hu Avoda Mibafnim Hu Mishamin Mibachutz. We know that the mezuzah is a shmir for Klal Yisrael. Hakadosh Baruch Hu, he's outside by the door guarding us. What a concept! Our leader, our God, actually services us. Again, Igyur. After 3 attempts, the Kaiser says, you know what? I can't afford for my whole army to become Jewish. Nobody's going to want to be in the army. They're all going to ask for exemptions. So, Sula Shadar Basrei. We have enough Haredim in our army at this point. I don't want any more. Zok Gemara weiter. We are my Shem law. Rivka had a whole bunch of action going on in her womb, and she didn't know what it was. So she went to Shem, and Shem told him, Shnei goyim bevitnech. You have two nations in your stomach. Omer Rav Yehuda Omer Rav, Atriki goyim elegayim. Because the ksiv is gimel yud yud mem. We pronounce it goyim, but the ksiv is gimel yud yud mem, and we dash in goyim as if one of the yuds was an aleph, because sometimes the yud is interchangeable with the aleph. Gay means greats, powerhouses. Who are these two powerhouses? Ze Antoninus for Rebbe. It was the only period of time where there were the greats of Rome and the greats of Klal Yisrael that were coexisting. They were so great, just to give us a measure of the wealth that they possessed. They never did not have murr on their table, horseradish. Kishois are cucumbers. And not radish. And they weren't always in season. They weren't always easy to get a hold of, but they always had plenty of it. Yomar Mar said that all these foods are very important for digestion. So if you're going to be having big sudas, you better have these digestion aids. The radish cuts the food up, I guess, in your stomach, which helps start the digestion process. Chazeres mahapach ma'achol, it flips it over. I mean, these are all words to describe helping with the digestion. And kishois marchiv ma'ayin, makes your stomach bigger so you can absorb more food. They're trying to ask, was Rav a fresser? Was Rabbi a fresser that he needed to open up his stomach? So if you look at the small little Tosfos says, Ein zerabusa elo sheyumarbim suda shulchanom sheyutrichen lechatich al hapich machol hach v'nemayim. So they had a lot of food, but the problem is, were they fressers? Zokt Tosfos immediately before that Tosfos, the end of the first Tosfos, when Rebbe died, he picked up his hand and he said, I didn't even enjoy a tiny little thing for my finger in this world. Rebbe hosted many people by all of his meals. So it was for his guests that he spared no expense to have the most beautiful sudas. He was always able to have that, as Antoninus as well. Why are cucumbers called kishuin? They're bad like a sword to the body of a person. Big, fully grown, those are harmful to a person, but the smaller ones are very helpful to a person. The Gemara says, quotes from the Mishnah, that the birthday and the yahrzeit of a king was also Yom Edom, which would therefore be also to do business with them 3 days before. Zok the Gemara, Reb Meir said Yom Misa, and the Chacham said, when do you say that? When do you say that? Only if they burnt the personal effects of the king when he died. Only that would indicate that it was being made into a day of Avodah Zara. But if it was just the day of his death, but they didn't have this process of burning his personal effects, then they're not making this into a day of Avodah Zara. Zogt Gemara Mechlal der Reb Meir Sover loish no misa sheish basreifa v'loish no misa she'ein basreifa polchil ba lavoidis kachavim. So you're telling me that it doesn't make a difference if there's a shreifa or not. It is, they're going to be dedicating the king and the day he died to Avodah Zara. Alma shreifa lav chukahi. So you see, shreifa is not part of their official process to declare the king as an Avodah Zara. Michlal, their abundant savri, it must be that their abundant hold, shreifa chukahi, burning the personal effects of the king is part of the designation of the Avodah Zara. But that can't be, because if that was the case, it would be also to do that for a Melech Yisrael. But Tanya, we learned, Sorfin al Hamalachim, we're talking about Malach Yisrael now, you couldn't burn their personal effects. And it's not considered the way of the goy, which would then be prohibited. As Rashi says, it's not considered Darkei Mori. What would be the problem of copying Darkei Mori? Because it says Loisasa Kimasayim. Zokt Gemara, the Chukahi You're not allowed to go in the way of the goyim. Elo dechula alma Sayrab Meir in our Mishnah and Sayrab Yehuda in the Mishnah holds shreifel chuki. It's not a designated custom that has to be done to declare someone in the Avoda Zarah. Allah chashivusi. It's merely an act that gives tremendous respect to the king. I guess no one should be able to use his personal effects. Rashi's chashivusi misha sarfin alav marin shemisasar chashuv alam. So it's not really an Avoda Zarah ritual. It's simply showing great reverence and respect to the deceased. The goyim, while showing great respect for the king, they're making into an Avoda Zarah, but they're not linked. It's lav davka an act of Avoda Zarah, and therefore it would be allowed. So if it's not a chukah, what's the machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda, Reb Meir and the Chachamim, who hold that dafka if they're shreifa? If it's just a chashivusa, why is that what makes it into a day of Avoda Zarah? Reb Meir sover loishna misa sheish b'shreifa, v'loishna misa shein b'shreifa. Palchi ba'al kachavim. No matter what, whether they show this extra level of respect for the deceased king or not, it's still a day that will be designated for Avoda Zarah. Rabban Savari misa sheish b'shreifa chashiva lehu palchi ba. They don't make every Yom Misa into an Avoda Zarah, only if it's a king that they revere. Doing the Sreifa shows that this king is revered. It's really like a simon. It indicates that this king they revered, and therefore it's going to be made into a Yom Avoda Zarah. But if they didn't do Sreifa of his personal effects, Loi Chashiva means they're not giving great respect to this king, and therefore they won't make this into a day of Avoda Zarah. Gufa. Sarfin alam malach. You're allowed to burn the personal effects of a Jewish king. This is not considered darkei amori. There's no issue of a v'chukasayim loisel lechu. Shenemar, we see the Navi Yirmiyah told Tzidkiah Hamelech, B'shalom Thomas, you're going to die in peace. You're going to die a natural death. You're not going to be murdered. Uv'misreifos avoisecha hamalachim. Just like your father, they burned his personal effects. They're going to burn your personal effects. In other words, you're going to be treated with the same reverence as the previous Malchi Yisrael. We're talking about comparing King Tzidkiyahu to his predecessors, and today's the Yosy of Reb Shner. So I just want to share a quick story. During the Holocaust, it became to Reb Aaron's attention that there were a group of yeshiva bachim that were trapped in Italy. Italy was under Nazi rule, and he was afraid that they would get killed, and they asked Reb Aaron to help get these boys out. So Reb Aaron knew of a big Italian mafia fellow in New Jersey. They were very much centered in New Jersey, and he prepared 2 briefcases, each with, I believe, $100,000 of cash in it, and he asked Irving Bunim, who was his right-hand man, to arrange a meeting with this head mafia guy. So they go to this head mafia guy, and they ask him to please help get these bachim out of Italy, and they gave him a briefcase of money. So he opens up the money, he sees a lot of cash in there, and he was hemming and hawing. So they gave him the other briefcase as well, thinking that maybe there wasn't enough money. So he said, nah, I don't need your money. I just want a blessing from the Grand Rabbi. So Irving Bunim translates into Yiddish, he wants a bracha from you. So Aaron tells him, so I wasn't there at the time, but I'm saying these words. So what happened, and that was it. And so Irving Bunim was always the one who had to make Reb Aaron's words more diplomatic. So he said, the rabbi wishes you that you should die peacefully like an animal dies. So he took the bracha, and that was the end of the story. 30 years later, after Reb Aaron had passed away, and Reb Shner was now the Yeshiva, a stretched limo pulls up to Yeshiva, and it's a mafiosa guy, and he wants to speak to the Grand Rabbi. So Reb Shner comes out, and he tells Reb Shner, my father was the first man in many generations in my family that didn't die a violent, brutal death, gunned down, thrown into a river. He actually was ill, and he died peacefully in his sleep. And he told us it was a blessing from the Rabbi Kotler. So I would like the same blessing. So Reb Shner says, I'm not Rabbi, and I can't give such brachas. That's a story that I heard. Sagt der Heilige Gemara weiter. Geshem shesorfen al hamalachim, schus hayog nalein la kol Yisrael. Geshem shesorfen al hamalachim, the same way you burn the personal effects of a king, kach sorfen al nasiim, they burn for the nasiim as well. Umahin sorfen al hamalachim. So what personal effects are burnt? Mitason, their beds, uchalei tashmishan, and the kalim that they use. I'm not sure exactly which kalim. Umaisa shemesh Rebbe Gamliel hazaken. Rabbi Gamliel hazaken, who was a nasi, he died. The sarf alav unkulus hager, and unkulus hager burnt for him shivim mana tsuri, 70 greatly expensive coins. Frag the Gemara, the amrit main sarf naleim mitasno chlita shmishon. Not just cash. That's not a personal effect. Gemara ema kishivim mana tsuri. He burned personal effects of Rabbi Gamliel hazaken that were so valuable, they were the value of 70 monetary. Now the question arises over here: do we know Rabbi Gamliel was very against extravagance, and he made it when he died? He told them he wants to be buried in the simplest of techrichim, because in Rabbi Gamliel's days the Mesim were so lavishly dressed that there were people who simply didn't have the money to dress their Mesim like everybody else did. They couldn't keep up with the Jones. And because of that, they would literally abandon Mesim in the street and run away because they were embarrassed that they couldn't make them the luxurious funeral that the Jones did. So in order to stop that from happening, Rabbi Gamliel says, I only want to be buried in the simplest fashion. And even so, Al Tkavod HaTorah, Unkel Sager held that we should still do this Shrefa ceremony and never want extravagant, but destroy property of 70 mana. He felt that Al Tkavod from Gamliel was warranted. Are you telling me there's nothing else that would get burnt? Vatanya Oikrin al Hamalachim. Oikrin was something that they did to the rear legs of animals. They would damage their sinews or their arteries. I don't know exactly what it is, but Rashi says they would slice it. Hagidin are sinews, tendons. They would cut them, the ones that were al parsois. The parsois are by the knee. They would cut them. What it in effect would do is it wouldn't cripple the animal. The animal would still be able to walk, but it would no longer be able to do work like pull loads anymore. The hooves? Oh, you're right. It's the parsa. So it's right above the hooves, below the knees. So they wouldn't become crippled. They couldn't walk.
Above the hoop.
Above the hoop.
That's what Rashi said.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I read it from Rashi. But it wouldn't. But before she expected that it wouldn't completely disable them, but they wouldn't be able to do work anymore. And that wouldn't include darkei mori. Amar Papa. So you see, there are other things. Amar Papa, it's sus sherachamalov. It's only the horse that was ridden upon by the king that was disabled, so that no one else would be able to ride on the king's personal horse. Frank Gemara, behemoth Torah, no, but not a behemoth Torah, because normally you don't ride behemoth Torah. You don't ride cows, right? So you tell me that was not damaged. But Tanya, we learned ikur sheyesh ba treifa aser. Now, if we're talking about tarfus in relation to this activity of crippling the animal, what's treifa doesn't apply, because if it's a behemoth tmeya, it's aser. It must be we're speaking about a behemoth Torah. V'shein b'treifa mutter. V'zeu ikur she'ein b'treifa. What's an example of this slashing of the tendons above the hoof? That's not treifa. Zokt the Gemara. It's hamanasher parsoisah minar kuvo lamata. It's meisir asher v'chayteich parsois shneir. You cut somehow the hoofs. I don't know exactly what this is, but minar kuvo lamata, below the knee, where it doesn't make an animal into a treifa. So Rashi says, Alma, mida osir the treifa, the behemoth taraskinu. Since it's osir to make it treifa, it must be speaking about a behemoth tara. It's actually machlokes Rashi and Tosfos if what the Gemara is saying is that it's osir to make an animal treifa, or if it means if you did it, the animal will be treifa. But regardless, if we're discussing treifa, it must be speaking by behemoth tara.
But this doesn't kill the animal within a year. A treifa is
it doesn't kill it.
So a treifa, definition of
riding the king's horse.
Definition of a treifa is if it dies within the year.
That's a very big machlokes if a treifa make someone die within a year. We had it earlier. There are cheaters who hold treifa doesn't treifa chaya. Treifa could live completely. Right? We had it when we were discussing what animals noich was allowed to bring into the teva. We had several versions. We had treifa chaya. We had a discussion if a treifa could give birth to another animal, and it was possible that not only could a treifa live, treifa could even give birth to another animal. So that's only one sheet who holds that a treifa won't live.
That was the rule.
So I know we talked about a kol panim. The question here is what type of behemoth tahira would be used as a personal effect by a king. Zakamar Tirgamara Papa Ba'agala, not Agala, but Egla Hamasheches Bekarin. We're talking about a calf that would be used to pull, maybe a bull calf that would be used to pull a wagon, the chariot of the king. So that's the behemoth tahira that we could be referring to. But again, it's only personal effects. Now we have a big problem. There's a problem of Baltashris. There's a problem of Char Balachayim. How do we deal with those problems? So Tosfos brings up both of those issues. So Frek Tosfos, I'm talking about in the wide lines at the bottom of Yud Aleph and Aleph. Arkadol Malachim Vim Timer Vamayle Parach Ikot Tzar Balachayim Kidaparach Lakamon Kaben Noisim and Noisim Meshuk Shal Avodas Kachavim. The Gemara later on, I don't know that Gemara, but the Gemara later on asks, what about Tzar Balachayim? The Bishlam Mishum Bal Tashchis Leka. Okay, it's not Bal Tashchis. Why? The kivon de lechvoida shal melech oisen kain. That's not called bal tashchis. It has an important purpose. Ain't kan hashchasa. Elahava kamay terchrichem shal meyamana. It's like expensive terchrichem, which everybody did in those days. Elatar balachai mechuter. How could they be matter this activity when they're unnecessarily causing pain to an animal? The Yeshloimar, a big chiddush in halacha that Tosfos is teaching us, the shiny kavod hamelech should cover the whole Yisrael. When you're mechaber the king, that's obviously being mechaber the entire nation that this king is ruling over. But Osi kavod rabim v'dochi tzar balachayim. Kavod harabim trumps tzar balachayim. Okay, let's see the Gemara weiter. Yom Taglachasik, the Mishnah says that one of the days of a day of Avodah Zara for a goy is the day that he shaves his beard. I'm sorry? The day he cuts his beard, trims his beard. Iboilu. What exactly is the Mishnah saying? Because it also talks about cutting his belurius. So what exactly does the Mishnah mean? Heichi katani. Does it mean Yom Taglacha Ziknoi Ba'nachas Belurusoi? It's one thing, meaning the day he cuts his beard and he doesn't cut his long hair in the back, so he trims his beard, he trims the top of his head, but he leaves, by contrast, he's glorifying the hair in the back that he uses to glorify Avodah Zara. Somehow that was glorifying Avodah Zara, the hair grew in the back. So is that what it means when it says Yom Taglacha Ziknoi? Is that also the same day that we're referring to with the beluris? Because that also makes the hair in the back distinct, because he's trimming his beard, trimming the top of his head, but not his beluris. Is that what is referring to? So it's one activity? Or maybe the Mishnah is talking about two separate activities. Aydama A, Yom Taglacha Ziknoi, and B, a completely different day where his Ha'voras Belusai. I guess from time to time, he would cut Rash's L'soif Shon at the end of the year, he would cut that growth of his hair up off the back, and that would be service to Avodah Zara. Again, I'm not sure, I'm not an expert in how they did this Avodah Zara, but it will be a different day, the day that they cut his, I'll call it his rear chup. His rear chup, right? Tashma, the Tani Tarvayu, in Yesod, they used to have barbers who would provide that service for free. Tashma, the Tani Tarvayu, the Tanya Tarvayu. It's actually both things are usher. A is Yom Taglacha Ziknoi, Va'anochas B'li comma, and also Yom Taglacha Ziknoi v'ha'avoras B'li. So both days are days of Avodah Zara, the day that he cuts his beard and his hair, but not the bluris, and then the day that he goes and cuts the bluris. There's two things that are also. They had another Yom Tif in Rome. And this Yom Tif did not occur annually. It occurred achas l'shivim shana, because they wanted to make sure that every guy should have at least one such experience in their lifetime. And this is what they would do. And what they were trying to do is show that Esav triumphs over Yaakov, and Esav is the true great one, and Yaakov is a phony, fake, and a fraud. How would they try to convey this? Mavin Adam Sholem, they would bring a healthy, full, strong person to represent Esav. Markivin Noisel Adam Chiger, they would have him ride on the shoulders of someone who was limping to symbolize Yaakov, who was Tzalei al Yerechai, after his struggle with the Malach, the Sarah Shal Esav. Umalbishin Oisoi, Big Day Adam Arishon, we know that Esav wore the begadim of Adam Arishon, the good smelling begadim of Adam Arishon. So the guy on top, representing Esav, will wear Big Day Adam Arishon. Umanichan Leberoshay, this is horribly disgusting and brutal. Karkifloi Shal Rabbi Yishmael, we all read the horrible, heart-wrenching tefillah or slicha, tchina, about Asar Burgi Malchus, and the Czar's daughter looked at the beauty of Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol, and she asked her father to skin him alive and to preserve his face so they should have his beautiful face. They actually made this, they preserved it, and they made it into a permanent face mask. So they put over the person playing Esav, they made him wear this face mask. What a horrible thing. If you look at Rashi, Karkiflo Shal Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol, Umeyarugi Malchus Haya, Umiteich Yof Yoy, Nichnas Belev Bas Keser, Ve'evshita Or Panov, Ve'chonta Ba'parsimon, she somehow preserved it with a parsimon, Shetei Mekuyemes V'lo Yishtana. V'adayin Munach begins a Romi. It's still in the Roman storehouses. It's probably still in the Vatican, the face, Rachman al-Islan, of Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol. And V'talulei B'tzavore Maskal Reish Zuza de Pisa. They took a very expensive stone, Rashi says it's puz, even Yikar Ad Ma'oid Ve'inamatzabodim, a very rare type of beautiful stone, and they hung around the neck of this person portraying Esav a huge amount, 200 zuz worth. As a shvakim be'inach, they would cover the streets with inach, which we learned was even greater than diamonds. It was an expensive stone as well. Umachrizin lefanov, and they would call out, not kacha yayasa leish, asher hamelech chafetz bikare. They actually tried to do everything back to us, right? So what do they call? This is what they said: Sach kiri palastar. Sach means he spoke. Kiri means the great king. Kachin, the officer. Sach kiri, referring to Yaakov Avinu, your great officer, spoke palastar nonsense, lies, meaning nevuas Yaakov, that Rashi. Shakara Levanov, La'achar Yomim, Shesoifan Ligoyel, Kozavu. It's a lie. So they're saying Yaakov was lying. Tosha says Kiri is a lashon of an officer. The Goyim would never even use such a word, such a complimentary word, to describe Yaakov. So Tosha is going on Yitzchak. The brachas that Yitzchak gave to Yaakov is a fraud. Then Achva the Marna Zayafna, the brother of our great master Esav, Zayafna, was a forgery. In other words, when he fooled Esav to steal the brachas away from Esav, the Chami, whoever sees this simcha has that opportunity. The loy chami, if you didn't see it, you're going to have to wait for 70 years to see this celebration again. And then they added, Mayahani l'Rama b'Rama Usay. What did it help the crook Yaakov in all his crookedness? Ulzayapna, and the forger b'Zayfnusay, with his forgeries, U'Mesaymin ba Hachi, and this is how they conclude the ceremony. Vai l'Dain kad yokum dain. Woe is to one when the other one gets strong. As Shem said, Ula'oim yemot. When Klal Yisrael is strong, Esav is weak, and when Esav is strong, Klal Yisrael is weak. So this was the bizarre ceremony that they had in Rome once every 70 years. Amar Rabashi, Zok Rabashi, Hechshilon PM l'Rishayim. The words that they themselves said actually work against them, because they weren't extremely careful in the order and the selection of their words. If the words they would have said was Zayafna, forger was who? Achva, the brother, the Marana of our great grandfather Esau. Then Kedakarmi, then they would in fact be accusing Yaakov of being the forger. But Hashtu the Amri, they say the Merona Zayafna, right? What was the lotion that they're saying? Achva the Merona Zayafna, right? Now the Achva the Merona Zayafna. What it sounds was is Achva the brother the Merona Zayafna of our grandfather the forger, right? So they didn't pick their words right. Merona Gufe Zayafnahu. That means they're really accusing the words that they say, if you analyze them carefully, are saying that Esau was the crook and the fraud. So we now listed off another Yom Tov. So Frek the Gemara V'Tana Didan my time Eloika Choshev Lo Lahai. Why didn't the Tana list this one as well as a Yom Edom?
Because it comes once in 70 years.
Oh, the Isa B'Chol Shata V'Shata Kachoshev. A Yom Tov that occurs every year, that's what the Tana was referring to. The lesser B'Chol Shata V'Shata Lo Kachoshev, that's not one of the Yom Tovim that he talks about. Zok Gemara, Hanidir. So the Mishnah was kind enough to share with us all of the Yom Tovim of the Romans, Uda Parsoimai. But what are the Yom Tovim of the Persians? Zok Gemara, Mutridi, Vituriski, Maharniki, Umaharin. The truth is, I'm really, really shocked because as Toronto is so multicultural and they celebrate every nourishes stupid Getchke holiday from every nationality, I'm surprised that we don't have in Canada a Mutridi Day and a Turiski Day and a Mahaniki Day. That, of course, you have to give your employees off and pay them for in full as well. I'm surprised that they don't have that in Canada with our leftist and lunatic governments. So my Mutridi. So what are the Yom Tov of the Parsoi? Mutridi, Vituriski, Mahaniki, Umaharin. So okay, now you got Hani the Parsoi to Remoy. We got their holidays. But the Bavloi, we also want recognition. We also want our Pride Day. What are their Yom Tovim? Maharniki, V'Akanisi, B'Chanuni, Maharniki, V'Aknise, and B'Chanuni, and Esavadar, Sanka de Mayo. Esavadar, Sanka de Mayo. Right? It's their version, it's the Bavli version of Senka de Mayo. Right? Amar Rab Chanan bar Rab Chisda Amar Rav, V'amri lo Amar Rab Chanan bar Rava Amar Rav, Chamisha Botei Avodas Kachav Kavunhem. There are 5 Kavute Botei Avodas Kachav, meaning that there with those places you're never allowed to avoid Zara because there are days, there are institutions that are always avoid Zara. Because anybody who wants to bring a carbon and do Avodah Zarah, he can go to these chapels and there's Avodah Zarah available every single day. Elohein, where are these 5 places? Beis Baal beBavel, Beis Nevoy in Kursi, Tarata shebemapok, Tzarifa sheba and Nashra sheba Ravya. So these were all chapels that were in these places. Kiyasher Avdimi, when Avdimi came, Haisifa Alein, all as well, Yerid shebe'ein Bechi, so the Yerid that was named Bechi, and Nidbacha Sheba'aku. So these were 2 more places. Ikadamri, it was a Nidbra Sheba'aku, and it was Nidbra Sheba'aku, not Nidbacha Sheba'aku. Rav Dimi min Arda Masni Ibcha, he says it's verkehrt. It's Yerid Sheba'aku and Nidbacha Shebein Bechi. So there was a little bit of a discussion what the names of these chapels were and where they were located. Omel Rab Chanan bar Rab Chisda Rab Chisda. My kavun hein. What does it mean that they're kavua? Right? We refer to them as Rab Chanan bar Rabba said in the name of Rav that these are botei avodas kam kavuin. Amalei hachi amar avua. This is what your mother's father said, your maternal grandfather said. Kavun hein la'olam, meaning tadura kula shata palchila. All year long, they're doing avodah zarah there. So I guess there are places that are dedicated. If you want to do your own little avodah zarah, you can go there. They'll always help you do avodah zarah there. Arma Shmuel, Begoila, in Eretz Yisrael, where the Goyim are really from, it's 3 days. It's 3 days before. It's 3 days before you have to stop doing business with them. But Begoila, where even the Goyim aren't so dedicated to their religion, only that day. Is even that day also for Rav Yehuda Shara Leila Rav Bruna. Rav Yehuda allowed Rav Bruna lizvune chamra to sell goyim wine on the day of their Yom Tov. Although Rav Gidol lizvune chitin b'chag sedatai, and he allowed Rav Gidol to sell wheat there was a day where different merchants got together that was their Avodah Zara, and he would allow them to sell wheat there. The reason why he allowed it because that wasn't in chosh lo kolkach. Then we're not even concerned about Avodah Zara because because they didn't even do it every year. So it was Yena dedication. They were so not committed. When it was convenient, they got together. They had a Taya convention and they would celebrate it. But it wasn't dedicated. So what you see clearly it wasn't so dedicated to Avodah Zara, and therefore they were allowed to do business there. Zok Gemara, what about if you have an ear sheyesh b'avodas kachavim? There's a city that celebrates Shemedam, so there we know that it's also to do business with them. But what about chutzlah? What if you're outside the city, close by to the city, but outside the city? Can you do business with people that are right outside the city? Zok the Mishnah mutter would be mutter. What about the opposite? Outside the city, they celebrated this getchke. Teichel mutter. You're allowed to nearby, right in the city, where they don't observe this Yom Tov, you're allowed to do business. What about Ma'u Leilech L'Sham? What happens if you want to, there's a city that's a place of Yom Edom where there's Avodah Zara, where you surely can't do business there, but there's someone in the city that you want to visit. You don't want to do business with them. You just want to go to visit them there. So now, if you go there, it's going to be Ma'ar Sign. It's going to look like you're going to do an Isser, to do business with them. Zok Gemara, it all depends. If the road that you're on, headed towards that city, only goes to that city, so it's obvious to anybody that sees you on the road that you're going to that city, that will be a problem. But what if that road splits off and then continues on to a different city that's not a place of Avodah Zarah? So then when you're on the road, people don't know necessarily that you're headed to the city of Avodah Zarah. So therefore, then it's also because everyone's going to know where you're going. But maybe if there's a continuation from that city, like you're on a train and one stop is the first stop is the Makam Avodah Zarah, but the second stop is not a Makam Avodah Zarah. So they could say you're not getting off there, you're going to get off in the next stop. So then it will be mutter. What does chutzah mean? How far away is chutzah? Like the butcher market of Aza, which was literally right outside. As Rashi says, Atluzo shuk shel behema, it was the shuk where they sold animals. Kamoi itlis, the tnan shoytlim beitlis, v'mkorim beitlis. Aza, it was an ear of Plishtim. V'haya ba'avodah kachavim, it was a city full of Avodah Zarah. V'haya chutzala yishuv samach le'ir ma'oid. And this Atluza, this animal market, was right out of the city. It was very close by, and that's considered chutzala, where you're allowed to do business. So Zok to Gemara, the Ikadamri, there's another way that this story went down. What would be the halacha there where it's so close? I could see that I could see you never went to Tzur, which is the city of Tyre in Syria. I could see you never went there. Because if you would have went there, you'd have seen that even though it's so close together, it still would not be Asr. For Royas, you would have seen Yisrael v'Oived Kechavim, but a Yisrael and a Goy together, Sheshavsu Shtei Kedeiros al Gabikir Achas. On the same stove, a Jew puts a kosher pot to cook his food, and a Goy puts a treifa pot, and the Chachamim did not object. Zok the Gemara, what was the concern that might happen that the Chachamim should be concerned about? Amar Abaye, in other words, we don't say, what if the Yid turns around and the guy quickly takes a piece of nevela and puts it into the Jew's pot? What would be, now, if what happened is Reb Chanina was bringing a raya from that example. So Reb Chanina is saying, even when there's a chash of an Isur Daraisa, a guy is putting the vela into your pot, even there you're not choshish. So in our case, we would say that they're not choshish for an Isur Daraisa either. We're not worried that if you sell to people that are so close to the city, that they actually have Avodah Zarah money, and you're actually having money that's also banah. And as you see, the Chachamim in such a case aren't even concerned about a potential of an Isur Daraisa. Rav Amar no. we would be choshev for a potential issue deraisa. There, the concern was only a concern of a derabanan, and that's where the chachamim allowed it. My lechoshelam chachamim by the cooking, it was mishum bishulei oivdei kechavim, which is only derabanan. Not that they would put nevela into your pot, but they would cause bishul oivdei kechavim for you. Maybe they're cooking apples. If they put an apple into your pot, there's no isser of nevela, but there's isser of a derabanan of bishul lakum, and the kavasa hachanami lechoshelam chachamim mishum yom edom. They weren't worried about Yom Edom, meaning if you're so close to the city of Avoda Zara, we would let you do business, and we're not concerned that they'll take that money or that animal and give it and serve it as an Avoda Zara in the neighboring city. So that's only an issue of Rabbanan. So in issue of Rabbanan, maybe they looked away from Lav Davka Nisha Deraisa. Rabbi Bar Ula Amar Lechashulam Chachamim Mishum Tzinoira. What the Chachamim weren't concerned about is Tzinoira. I didn't prepare this, so we're going to stop here. We'll have to finish it up tomorrow. I just hopped that I fell asleep as I was preparing, and I fell asleep over here. So Mitchell will be mamshich tomorrow.